Hello and welcome in everyone to this week's Sports and Leisure History Look Back. I'm Jeff Klein and I'm here as always with my good friend and sports history knowledge extraordinaire, Clayton Hamilton. Clayton, how are you doing?
I am great. So many basketball games and hockey games, and it's nice that it's getting whittled down a little bit because there's not as much on the screen these days, and I get to pay a little more closer attention to them, which is fantastic. Things getting saucy today in Montreal. Woo! There's a little 5-on-5 brouhaha with half a minute left, and then another one with no time left. So Buffalo Montreal has been stellar ice hockey.
And for fans who've been following along, you know that Clayton does not just stick to the major sports here in the North America. Really, we got cycling, we got alpine ski jump going on in Germany yet.
No, not yet. It's summer. They're actually probably headed down this alpine skiers to New Zealand pretty soon in order to do some summer training. But the Giro d'Italia did start with a massive crash on stage one. And they're opening in Bulgaria, so they had 3 stages of Bulgaria. They're off, and then they're going to resume in Italy. Nothing that affected any of the top performers, but you don't want to start day one of a grand tour with a 45-mile-an-hour crash in the final kilometer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're just
well,
like,
we're going to
yeah.
get into the history. Well, I feel like if I go down this rabbit hole of all these other sports with you, sometimes we just trail off.
Right, exactly. I hear you.
Yeah. So I want to jump into the history for this week because we do have a lot to cover. It was so this week we're going to talk about, or on this episode we're going to talk about all the history from May 4th. I'll refrain from making any Star Wars references since I know you're not the biggest Star Wars fan. From the movie franchise from the 80s. I think you know at least that much. But I do know you're a big fan of the 90s Atlanta Braves, and this past week we lost 2 giants from the Braves franchise. Really sad and really close together. And Ted Turner, who's, I think well known in baseball, but a lot of other, media, a lot of other areas, CNN and so forth. And then longtime manager Bobby Cox. And I do want to ask you about Bobby Cox because it seems the further we get away from the 90s and that really dominant era of Braves baseball, people start looking at, well, he won all those divisions, but only one World Series. What's your thought on that? I know we always talk about how only one team can really win the championship. So
Only one team can win, and you got to be in it to win it. And they were there, and they had a chance every year. And the randomness that surrounds how somebody wins a championship, particularly the larger and larger that the field gets, and it makes the regular season less and less important that you had such a great season. It doesn't take away from what those Atlanta Braves teams did or what Bobby Cox did. Because if he was playing in the era of the 40s and 50s where all he had to do was have the best record in the National League, then he'd been in the World Series a bunch. And now we're having a different conversation. So with expanded playoffs, you just got to get there, and he got there.
yeah, he was won the division for 15 straight seasons except for one in 1994, which was a strike-shortened season. And he was in 5 World Series, although, as I mentioned, only one win. I feel like it's such a product of our GOAT-centric culture now, where it's like, if you don't win a championship, you're nothing. And it's like, the Braves were pretty amazing. I mean, they had one of the most dominant pitching rotations we've seen in the history of baseball. And great manager, great run for that team.
And you think about what is a slippery slope and what may have been if they had won another World Series. But you also think about like what may have been if things are different in 1984. And in 1984, the Atlanta Braves had almost had a deal to get Gary Carter from the Expos. And that deal was basically almost done, and they didn't really communicate it to Ted Turner, who had to sign off on all the things, and there was communication lost in the messages, and they never ended up doing the deal, which Ted Turner probably ultimately would have stamped that deal. And now you have, in the 80s, Gary Carter in that lineup with Dale Murphy and Chris Chambliss and Bob Horner and some of those guys on that pitching staff. And the rest of the 80s might look a little bit different. The Mets probably certainly don't win the World Series in 86 without having Gary Carter, which means Bill Buckner probably doesn't have the ball between his legs, which means the Red Sox might have been able to beat the Astros, and the whole world in Boston is different. And Joe Torre might still be the manager of the Braves moving forward, which means he doesn't go to the Yankees, which means who knows what happens to the Yankees. So you think of all those little things that could have happened if Gary Carter just gets the communication right to Ted Turner and he becomes a Brave, and Bobby Cox may never even come back to be the manager. Remember, he was the manager earlier in the 70s, and he might not have come back in the 90s. Right. And the whole baseball world might be different for those two guys, Ted Turner and Bobby Cox. So there you go.
Yeah, it's crazy to see all the what ifs. I mean, you can do that in so many sports, right? There's Tom Brady facing the Raiders, and there's the what if there that can go different way. What does that do to Tom Brady's career? But in baseball, there's so much of that what if, and so much is intertwined, and one thing sets off a chain reaction for a series of other events. So just really interesting. Just one last comment. I wanted to give you an opportunity. You mentioned Dale Murphy. I know you're a huge Dale Murphy fan, and I just wanted to say a few comments about him. And I think he's probably one of the most overlooked players from that Braves franchise because it was such a pitching centric team, but or from their dominant period.
Yeah, Dale Murphy was the Atlanta Braves, and he was the Atlanta Braves thanks to Ted Turner for an entire country at 7:05 Eastern every night. Mm-hmm. The world got to see the greatness that was Dale Murphy, and it is a tragedy that he is not in the Hall of Fame, and I will go to my grave saying that Dale Murphy belongs in the Hall of Fame, and nothing would make me happier than seeing Dale Murphy get a jacket and go where he belongs.
Yeah, I'm with you. Dale Murphy should be in the Hall of Fame. I'm with you on that. So, but let's move on. We got a lot of different history to cover, and there's a debate we just mentioned about the Braves. Whether or not their 90s dynasty was a failure. But who was not a failure? And we posted about him on May 9th, going back to 2010. Tim Clark, the South African golfer, made a massive run on the final 2 days, including shooting 67 on the final round at TPC Sawgrass to win the Players' Championship. And on the final round, he finished a stroke ahead of Robert Allenby, as well as renowned players Lee Westwood and Davis Love III, who both tied for fourth on that last day. Big win for Tim Clark, although he didn't have really an extended career, but up to that point, he was really, sort of, for anyone who hadn't yet won sort of a major title, he was the cash leader, right?
He was. He had won more money than anybody on the PGA Tour at the time and not had a PGA Tour victory. And we're not talking about him as in an Anna Kournikova sort of way where he didn't have a championship. He had 2 wins on the European Tour. He had 3 wins on the European Tour and 2 on the Sunshine Tour. And he was also on 3 President's Cups teams. So he was not a guy that was just completely out of the blue. Here's a guy that was running second, third, top 10 really for a long period of time, and he finally got that big victory. And although it's not a major, I think most people around the tour would call the Players' Championship the 5th major. It's like the Indian Wells is to tennis, the Players is to golf, and it's in effect the 5th major. And for him to put together back-to-back rounds of 66 and 67, because he was pretty far off the lead going into the weekend, was a really wonderful weekend for him and an exhibition of really good iron play.
Yeah, and he was actually only the second player ever to win his first PGA Tour win, making the Players his first PGA Tour win. And so that, he's someone who really came into golf with a disability and, some physical challenges. And then later in his career, as he got, following 2010, he ran into some other injuries, which once he really got going, it kind of limited his ability, right?
Yeah, he started with a wrist injury the first year that he was on the tour, which he almost wasn't even able to keep his tour card because he had so many injuries and he missed so many weeks. And then he started to get the wrist injury all taken care of, and then it was his back and his shoulder, and he had a slew of things that sort of derailed him. But one of the things that was funny about this tournament is one of the things that really helped him is Tiger Woods withdrew on Sunday from this event. And that's when Tiger first had his bulging disc problem. And so Tiger had to step away from this event on Sunday. And it really helped open, even though Tiger was a little bit further down on the leaderboard, his presence on a Sunday, you never know what you're going to get. So that really helped him. And then his short iron play, particularly at a course like the Players, was really helpful for him to be able to get up and down on 17, 18, be able to put the shots in the right spot on the green. Because you all know at Sawgrass, right, there's so much water, particularly down the end of the stretch. You got the island green at 17. You've got water all on the left on 18, you've got the high rough on on the right on 18, and he was able to have 5 birdies in the last 6 holes. He played a completely bogey-free round in order to get his championship, and it was really good to see it for somebody like Tim Clark, who's been around the tour, who was well liked on the tour, to be able to break through for the first time.
Yeah, and I think he was known for really exceptional accuracy. I think from 2009 on, he was never lower than 5th in driving accuracy. And he was early in his life. He had a condition called radial and ulnar deviation of the wrist, and it really prevented him from extending his left arm and turning up his palms while his arms were outstretched. So because of that sort of challenge, he changed his swing and he compensated. It resulted in him generally driving the ball 40 to 50 yards shorter. And so that's when he really developed that accuracy. So he really changed up his game to really compensate for that. And I think based on the conditions you described, that really helped him in that to win that title.
Yeah, it certainly did, because you can get in trouble at Sawgrass if you hit too far. And one of the things he had talked about throughout his career about the way that courses are set up. And he said they're really set up to help all of the long hitters, that the fairway's narrow between about 250 and 280, which is about where he drives. And that's the hardest place it is to land a ball. And if you're hitting 300, it's like the fairway opens up past 280 and it's almost, half as wide again as it is at that 250 to 280 mark. And he said he really needed to develop those iron plays in order to play against guys like Jack Nicklaus and Tiger Woods and Gary Player, who was a huge influence on his career, being from South Africa. But one of the maybe lesser heralded players from South Africa, you tend to think of Gary Player and Louis Oosthuizen and those guys. But he certainly made his mark on it, and they said he made 3 President's Cup teams, and he played in every match on the President's Cup. He didn't sit out any of the matches there. So he was a major factor for the international team and for South Africa.
Yeah, and he suffered an elbow injury in 2011, elbow tendonitis, and really struggled, had to withdraw in 2011, wiped out all of 2012. But he came back strong to win in 2014 for the only other PGA Tour title that he won. Ultimately he had to retire in 2016 at age 42. So a shortened career as far as golfers go. But he tried to do the best that he could with sort of the hand that he was dealt, whether that was issue with his wrists or an injury when he first started out his career, as you mentioned, or the injury later in his career.
Yeah, and hopefully we might see him in some senior events now that he is old enough to do that. Last that I had heard from him, he was healed up pretty good and playing recreationally and still around the game, but had not decided whether or not he felt he was healthy enough or could play well enough to attempt some of the senior tour events. But I would not be surprised to see him pop up maybe here in the next year and a half on one of these Champions Tours.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of what South African golfers, or where he would fall in that hierarchy. And you mentioned Gary Player. Ernie Els is another one that comes to mind. He's probably in that second tier of players, not quite at the elite level, but still very good. He made $24 million over his career, which is pretty good. We had mentioned that he was had the most money up to the point before he won the Players. He had made $14 million, almost $15 million up to that point. So a pretty decent career. Never did rank higher than 14th, which he achieved in 2006. But overall, very solid player. Really, really nice career for a pro golfer.
Yeah, and another guy that came through the NCAA system.
That's right.
And even though he's from South Africa, he went to NC State, and you can't really put a value on how important the NCAA collegiate sports system is, not just for American athletes, but for international athletes, particularly in sports like golf or track and field or swimming, that really gives athletes from around the world a place to develop and compete in those years that sometimes get lost between your high school career and your elite level. And the NCAA provides that platform. So not just for American athletes, but for athletes around the world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know the NCAA, and rightfully so in many cases, gets a bad rap and gets criticized for a lot of things that they don't do very well, to be honest. But I do think that the infrastructure they create for a lot of these kind of lesser followed sports, gymnastics, golf, and so forth, really allow those players to excel. And as you mentioned, they're really a hub for a lot of international players. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think when the NCAA does something right, we should definitely recognize that.
Yeah, they're so important in all of the Olympic sports.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about something else we posted about, and I was really glad we're able to talk about this, because it's some good news for Mets fans. And Mets fans don't have a lot of good news these days, so I'm happy to come here and offer some good news for Mets fans. And it's not that long ago, went back to 2022, and the Mets overcame, on May 5th of that year, the Mets overcame a 7-1 lead that the Phillies had over them going into the ninth inning. And they scored 7 runs, ended up winning 8-7, and it actually broke a streak of 857 games where a team trailing by 6 or more runs in the ninth inning would go on to win, which is pretty incredible. 857 games. That's a year that the Mets, they won 101 games, although they finished second in the NL East. But a pretty good year for the Mets, and kind of a harbinger of things to come in that game.
A little bit, but also what's really weird about this is that Philadelphia, who was having a terrible April, they went 11-11, and then they went on to go 10-18 in May. They went all the way to the World Series, that Phillies team. And they had sort of figured out maybe some things that were plaguing them early in the year. And that's when they had the manager change, was not too far after that. And Joe Girardi was gone and Rob Thompson took over. And they made an improbable run to play the Astros in the World Series that year. They did lose in 6 games, and they got no hit in one of those games. Won't forget that part.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting experiment sort of for the Phillies of how to construct a roster. And this was the beginning of what the Philadelphia Phillies championship window has been. And I would say that, 2022 has been the start of it. And even though they have a rough beginning to this year, I think that they're still in their championship window. And I would say they probably have about another 2 seasons beyond this one while they're still in that really viable window of being able to win the World Series.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of coinciding with Bryce Harper. And Bryce Harper's a little bit on the downturn, although he's still a legit threat every time he comes to the plate. But I feel like he's maybe got 2 or 3 more really good years ahead of him, and then we're gonna start to see that decline. But I think this kind of goes back to something that you and I talk about sort of offline a lot, and bullpens and how bullpens are used. And I know you have a lot of issues with sort of the current state of MLB and how teams approach bullpen and construct bullpens. Are you a fan of? It comes down to sort of art versus science, right? So where do you fall sort of in that spectrum?
I feel that a manager has 2 functions when it comes to baseball. And they are often hamstrung in being able to do those jobs by the baseball ops people who say, this is the way the team should be optimally run, and this is what we want them to do and how we want them to do it. Problem is that can't always happen the way that the formula says that it should happen. Right? There's no accounting for variables. So there are 2 things that a manager must do. And the first thing a manager must do is the same thing that any manager must do in any job at any business. It doesn't matter if you are running a coffee shop or a car dealership or a factory floor or a Fortune 500 company. It matters not. The first thing a manager must do in any situation is disseminate information to people in a manner in which they are willing to hear it. Right? That's the first thing you got to do. You got to be able to communicate, and you've got to be able to do it in a way that they're willing to hear you and understand and do what you want. All right? The second thing, which is baseball, or actually not baseball specific, but sports specific, is you need to be able to, 1, watch the game, and 2, understand what you are seeing. And that's the part where the baseball ops peoples do not account for it. All they have is a formula of, we want this guy to throw X amount of pitchers this day, and we want this guy to get work, and we want that guy to get work, and we don't want to have somebody pitch 3 days in a row, which was a Joe Girardi thing. He said he would never use his pitchers more than 3 days or 2 days in a row. So 2 days only. If you pitch 2, no matter what the situation, we're never going to bring you in. It doesn't matter how easy or little or what the pitch count was in those past 2 days, you're not playing. So he was very analytically driven that we're going to follow these baseball ops people. But you have to be able to watch the game and understand what you're seeing in order to know whether or not it's a good idea. Example, Pete Carroll, Super Bowl, Marshawn Lynch, running down the Patriots, gets to the goal line. The big book of math, the binder, what the football ops people said to do was, this is the situation where we throw the ball. If you watch the game and you understand what you're seeing, and you see that Marshawn Lynch has run down their throats all the way down the field, and everybody on the defensive line is standing there with their hands on their knees, huffing and puffing, you know that he can rush another yard. So if you watch the game and you understand what you're seeing, you never throw an interception on the goal line, you score with Marshawn Lynch. And that's the problem that these baseball managers are having with their bullpen, is they're not watching the game and they're not understanding what they're seeing. And if they do understand what they're seeing, they're not allowed to act on it.
I can see you're really passionate about this. But I want to say I kind of align with some of that. And I think I've come along a little bit more as the years have gone on and the more baseball I watch. I do think analytics have a place in the game, and they're definitely something to sort of build a foundation around. But I'm with you. You got to watch the game. You got to know the situation. You got to know sort of a good feel for leaving a guy in. I mean, so much of baseball is mental. We hear that all the time, right? So if a team is struggling against a pitcher, sometimes taking that pitcher out, even if the analytics say, this is a better matchup, that's a huge mental relief for the opposing lineup, because they're in their head, they're struggling. I think you have to really know the game, know your players, and kind of understand what's going on. And I do think part of this is the result of, as managers are fired more often, and you have managers staying in for shorter periods of time. One, they have less freedom to go against what the front office says, and two, they don't really have the feel for the game, like that because you can only get that with experience, right? You only can really understand game. A manager who's in their first year, they're probably going off of what the analytics say because they're still sort of getting that sixth sense about the bullpen. But I don't know how many times I watched a game and you feel like, oh man, they're making this switch, and it just doesn't feel like the right time. And again, I'm not in the dugout. I'm not in all the strategy meetings, so obviously I can only say that from sitting in front of my TV or sitting in the stands. But I think a lot of it goes sort of in that bucket where you just need to get that experience.
You need to get that experience, and you're not able to get it. Look at what the Marlins are doing this year. The Marlins are calling every single pitch from the dugout like it's a college game, like it's a high school game. Right. When is that catcher and that pitcher going to learn how to call a game? They have the best view of anybody. They know, oh, is he late on my fastball? Because it says that he's a really good fastball hitter, but for some reason he's not seeing it today because I just saw that swing and he was late. So why am I going to throw him a changeup away? All I'm doing is speeding his bat up and giving him a big part of the field to hit.
Yeah.
Even though that's what the big book of math says. But just remember, even if the big book of math says that something's going to happen 80% of the time, that still means it's not going to happen 20% of the time.
Right.
So it drives me nuts that they do that. And when you look at the way this specific Phillies team was built in order to operate, let's remember what 2022 looked like. It was the first year of the designated hitter across National League and the American League. They wanted Bryce Harper, who's coming off injury year. He was going to be the DH, which means that Kyle Schwarber and Nick Castellanos both had to play outfield for that whole season. And what does the big book of math say? It says both of them are really bad fielders. Right? So the big book of math says, we got to score a lot of runs because these guys are going to hurt us defensively.
Not just the big book of maths. Your eyes tell you that as well.
Except, guess what the big book of math didn't get right? That Nick Castellanos played 124 games in the outfield and made 0 errors. What does it tell you? Kyle Schwarber played 139 games in the outfield and made 1 error. So the big book of math, right, it's like, we're going to build it this way. But then the big book of math was wrong on how they played in the outfield that year.
I think the big book of math also for defense, right, there's routes. And I do think it's analytics, if there's anywhere it struggles the most, it's trying to quantify defensive metrics because it is very hard to quantify if someone takes the correct route to a ball. Because sometimes there's environmental factors, there's situational factors, right? So I think it's really hard to get to that. I think, one thing I do like, I want to maybe mention sort of this era of building a bullpen. I think one thing I like is the move that teams have to not just, righty-lefty matchup, but, having a pitcher that specializes in a certain type of pitch, knowing that opposing hitters, whether they're righty or lefty, may struggle against that kind of pitch, right? So that the middle of the lineup struggles against... There's going to be that key at bat, and number 4 hitter struggles against a changeup or a sinker, or whatever the case is. I think some of that is really useful in how they've done some analysis, and that's where I lean more into the science and less the art, because that sort of, it's hard to quantify a lot of that without that science, without that analysis that you can get. So I think there are some areas that they've done a really good job with. But another area, just sort of the flip side of that, is usage. And we talk a lot about that, right? Bullpen usage and trying to sort of go with this formula throughout the season, and especially if you're a playoff contending team, the one of the big factors that's missing is, you're using all those pitchers early in the season, whether they're going to be down the stretch, because a lot of those analytics are done from an optimal perspective, right? This pitcher's fresh. They haven't thrown a lot. When you get those innings stacking up on their arms by September, that's maybe a different pitcher.
Yeah, when you look at this Phillies team and you see going against that, because we're rushing to get to our bullpen guys. Mm-hmm. During the regular season, they were 5th in the amount of innings that a starter went. In MLB, there were about 5 and a little over an out and a half. So like 5.5, so like 5 1/3 and plus per start. And then you get to the World Series and they got 6 games, 4 innings, 5 innings, 3 innings, 4 innings, 3 innings, 5 innings. They're all under what that normally were during the regular season in a time when you really kind of want to lean as much as you can and have those good starts that win games. And here we are rushing to the bullpen. And it all goes back to what I was saying about watching the game and understanding what you're seeing. Just remember this, that your analytics and your charts and all of those things are basic blackjack strategy. Watching the game and understanding what you're seeing is counting cards. And everybody would rather count cards if you're trying to beat the house. So it's really, really important to watch the game and understand what you're seeing, and then have the power in the agency to be able to make those decisions that may be against, what the big book of math says or what the basic blackjack chart says. Because there are times that it is advantageous to you at the blackjack table to go against the big book of basic strategy.
I read a quote from Pete Alonso. He took a jab at David Stearns, GM. David Stearns, the Mets GM.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I guess the negotiations had fell apart, right? And Alonso's now, he's no longer with the Mets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said you'll be fuddling. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like you'll be a bean counter and be fumbling around with your formulas while people are evaluating my potential Hall of Fame career. And it was I have to find that quote, but it was basically saying like you're buried in your formulas and your statistics. I'm out there sort of on the field playing the game and using my eyes to evaluate the game. And I thought it was a funny quote, and I happened to read it just this past week. So,
and that's the great thing. You think about those things like UZR and defensive ratings, Sun, and all these things you're saying. How do you quantify things defensively? And what they're telling you is, don't use your eyes to quantify it. Use our eyes. We'll use our eyes. Because it's ultimately coming down to somebody's evaluation of, is that a defensive run saved? Can he get to the ball in the hole? And then what they want you to do is go to the binder, and the binder will tell you whether or not Elly De La Cruz can get to the ball in the hole. If I want to know if Elly De La Cruz can get the ball in the hole, I'll watch him take ground balls and see if he can get to the ball in the hole, and I'll watch his footwork, and I'll see if he can make the throw. So why do I have to use your eyes? Because my eyes are probably better than some guy with a computer, because it all comes down to their eyes.
As you know, I follow the Dodgers, more than any other team, and I think about the evolution of Dave Roberts. And one of the things he got criticized a lot for earlier in his manager career was, being so beholden to some of these statistics, but you can really see his growth over the last few seasons. And I think, especially the past couple postseasons, it's been a lot more of an art form for him than the science, right? Where he's felt like, I'm going to leave this guy in an extra inning. And I think it's funny because people are so used to the Dave Roberts of how he was the first few years, because that's just kind of what we got accustomed to. And so when he leaves a pitcher in an inning longer than you expect, you're like, oh, wow, like, look at Dave. But now it's becoming a little bit more of a regular thing, and you can see the starters going a little bit longer than they normally do, than the Dodgers have had in the past. And I think part of it is they have gotten burned, where the bullpen is totally gassed by the postseason, right? So I think some of that is, again, goes back to managers just need that time to learn the game and get that sense about kind of what levers to pull when managing a bullpen.
All I know is that fast food uses the formula 5-star chefs create the dishes they go.
That's true. That's true. So I wanted to also get into our next topic. It's also sticking with baseball and moving on to sticking with bullpens, but we posted about Kenley Jansen joining the 400 save club. So on May 10th in 2023, he was then with the Red Sox. Jansen became the 7th pitcher that joined the 400 save club. He currently has 483. He actually got one today. He's with the Tigers. They've won today 6-3. So he picked up another save. Tigers are actually his fifth club. But thoughts on Kenley Jansen? We hear so much about Mariano Rivera and Trevor Hoffman. Billy Wagner recently got in the Hall of Fame. Is Jansen in that sort of tier of closers to you?
I feel like people think he is. And I feel like when you probably sit down and you do nothing but an evaluation of the numbers, that he will probably be looked at that way. He will probably be in the Hall of Fame. Whether or not, I don't think he'll be a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he might be a second or third when you run him up against people like Lee Smith. Mm-hmm. When I think about great closers, I do not think about Kenley Jansen. He is not somebody that crosses my mind if I were to put together an all-time bullpen. I don't know if he would make my all-time bullpen. And he does have a pretty good ERA at 2.6. He does have a lot of saves. But what's always bothered me about Kenley Jansen is, one, I never feel like a game is in hand. I never feel like I have the advantage when Kenley Jansen comes in, as opposed to somebody like Mariano Rivera, where you felt like you have the advantage. Or even a guy like Billy Wagner, where you feel like you might have the advantage. And I know part of it, Jeff, is, and I know you laugh at me all the time when I complain about relievers and how scared I am about they're going to give up runs, right? I'm always scared every time a reliever comes in that's what's going to happen. But did you know that Kenley Jansen, with his 64 blown saves, has blown 11% of his save opportunities? 11%, Jeff. 11. That's quite a bit of non-confidence.
Yeah.
A guy like Billy Wagner was 8.6. Mariano Rivera is 6.5. Right? So that's significantly less than a guy like Kenley Jansen.
I hear what you're saying, and I think that's probably... I think a lot of fans probably who followed baseball for a while feel the same about Kenley Jansen. I think back to when I watched him, because I've watched him pitch a lot, and his demeanor on the mound was kind of passive, I think. So he gets on the mound and kind of feel like he doesn't have that aggressive approach like a Trevor Hoffman, Mariano Rivera, Billy Wagner. I didn't really see Lee Smith pitch, so that I can't say. But he did have that kind of laid-back approach, and so I wonder if some of that are optics related, because you want your closer to be like aggressive and really going after the opposing hitters. He does have comparable or better numbers than Wagner and Hoffman, and I've told you this before. I actually think Trevor Hoffman's a little overrated. I think he got good marketing out of his changeup, but Billy Wagner to me is the superior to Trevor Hoffman. I'd take both of them on my team any day, but I don't know. He just didn't have that demeanor like you have those really like aggressive closers.
And he nibbles a lot.
Yeah, right.
And I really want a guy that's going to come after my hitters, and I don't want to see my closer throwing 25, 30 pitches in an inning to get 3 outs. I want to see sub 12, honestly. But I do think he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, and sure. I do think if I dug deeper into his numbers, that when you compare him to, I'd like to sit down and compare it to somebody like John Franco, who is not in the Hall of Fame, but John Franco is somebody that I think about as a more lights out closer than I do think about somebody like Kenley Jansen. I think things bother Kenley Jansen on the mound that don't bother John Franco, like a runner on second doesn't bother John Franco at all. But I understand and completely get that he's not Ryan Helsley. He's not Andres Munoz. And there are people in this game now that are just oohing and awing over Helsley and Munoz because they throw the ball hard. But remember that 11% blown save rate. for Kenley Jansen, why don't you try 19.4% on Ryan Helsley? Why don't you try 20.5% on Andres Munoz? It's not just my imagination that those guys throw away games. You're looking at 20%, 1 out of every 5 days. You're looking at one day a week they're throwing away a game. And Kenley Jansen is significantly better than Munoz and Helsley. And if you ask a lot of those baseball op guys, who do you want? Who do they want? They want Munoz and they want Helsley. And those guys throw games away all the time.
I knew when we got to this segment that you would work in a way to go after Ryan Helsley.
I would, because he throws away games. 19.4% of them he throws away.
Right.
And we can't just sit around and talk about how great he is. Because here's the thing. I don't care what your spin rate is on ball 1. I really don't care what it is on ball 4.
Right. So I remember the Kenley Jansen. I have a story for you. The Kenley Jansen 2017 season where he was simply incredible. He placed 5th in Cy Young voting, but he had 68 innings and he threw 109 strikeouts and only 7 walks, which is like pretty eye-popping there. But my biggest memory from him of that season is a sad memory because I was in the stands for Game 2 of the World Series, and it was 3-2, and here Dodgers won the first game, looking to go up 2-0 on the Astros, and here comes Kenley Jansen, and the numbers he had, you're like, it's over, game over. Kenley Jansen is going to shut this down. Dodgers are ahead 3-2. That's it. And Marwin Gonzalez hit a home run about 20 seats over, landed about 20 seats from me, and it was so disheartening, and it was a sad experience with Kenley Jansen. But that season was just eye-popping. I remember me and some friends, we chat about Dodger games a lot, just like how incredible his strikeout to walk rate was.
Mm-hmm. Well, think about how good Mariano Rivera's season was in 2001, and he couldn't get the biggest out that he needed in the 9th inning and Game 7 of the World Series. Greatest closer alive, and that's the one that he blew. But it does happen. I just feel like I'm uneasy with Kenley Jansen, but I will freely admit that I bet that he, under more scrutiny, is significantly better than I anticipate he would be.
Yeah, his ERA plus is 155, which means he's 55% better over his career than the average reliever. And he's been put into so many high leverage situations. It's almost all high leverage situations. He's been, had high expectations on teams that have very high ceilings. And everyone's bringing their A game against Kenley Jansen because they want to beat that team that he's on. So I think that also counts for a lot. The blown save number is surprising. I actually didn't know it was that high. But I think it sort of adds up because there were games you'd watch and you're just pulling your hair out because you're right, he's nibbling a lot, and you're like, just, you have the stuff, just get the hitter out.
Mm-hmm. Trust it.
Exactly. A guy who didn't need a bullpen. Let's move on to Jamie Moyer, who we talked about He became the oldest pitcher ever to throw a shutout. And I'm missing the day here, but it was earlier in the week. It's 47 years, 170 days. He became the oldest pitcher in MLB history to throw a shutout. It was a 2-hitter against the Braves. And the Phillies won 7-0. So he's kind of a relic of the past, right? We're talking about sort of like past eras with pitchers throughout this episode. Jamie Moyer, we're not going to see another pitcher like him again, are we?
No, and the sad part is it's not that a pitcher like Jamie Moyer couldn't exist and couldn't be successful. It's that you're not going to find a scouting department that's brave enough, or a baseball ops department that will allow somebody like Jamie Moyer to get signed. And it doesn't even matter how successful he is. And it doesn't matter what level it's at. He could be really successful at getting guys out in high school and they won't draft him. He could be really successful at getting guys out in college, and he's not going to even get an invite. He could be down in the DR and he goes to one of the academy tryouts and they're going to put him on the gun and they're going to say thank you very much and send him on his way. And so we're not even going to get to know if that guy could be successful because that guy will never, ever get past the gatekeepers in order to see whether or not he can get anybody out. And that's sad.
The closest I was trying to think of some comps, at least that are fairly recent, and the closest I could think of was someone like maybe Rich Hill, or Kyle Hendricks, although Hendricks was a righty. Mm-hmm. But I think those are low strikeout guys who just rely on a lot of control and precision. And Rich Hill, I think, is notable for his age, so that's probably similar to Moyer, although Moyer pitched. I don't think Rich Hill's going to reach the same age that Moyer pitched and was effective. But it's pretty crazy. Over 4,000 innings pitched, officially 4,074 innings pitched. Moyer averaged 6 1/3 innings per start, mm-hmm. which is pretty crazy considering how, he was pretty old when he was still racking up a lot of innings. And I guess it's a tribute to him not throwing hard, not using max effort.
Mm-hmm. And not having a high pitch count.
Not having a high pitch count, right? Probably getting a lot of first strikes mm-hmm. on batters. So, it's just really mind-blowing to just think that.
Some things that are crazy about Jamie Moyer, and when you go back to when he first debuted, his debut was at Wrigley Field against Steve Carlton. That's how far back he went. In a game at Wrigley where there were no lights at the stadium. So he pitched pre-light at Wrigley Field against Steve Carlton. And in that game, Jeff, do you know what happened in that game?
I do not know what happened.
The Phillies wore their road powder blue uniforms. Remember, they wear them now. Remember those?
Yeah.
In 2010, when Jamie Moyer pitched for the Phillies, they brought the throwback uniforms back for him to wear, the same as his debut when he pitched against the Phillies. He's been around that long that he was there for the throwback of his major league debut. Do you know what else happened in that game, Jeff?
What happened?
The very first person that he ever faced was Ron Renicky of the Philadelphia Phillies. That was the first batter. In Jamie Moyer's last game as a Colorado Rocky, Ron Renicky's nephew, Josh Renicky, came in to relieve him. That's how long Jamie Moyer had been around. When he retired, it had been determined that he had pitched to 9% of all major league hitters in the history of the game. 9% have gone and faced Jamie Moyer. That's all I got.
Yeah, I've heard the 9% number before, which is mind-blowing. And he's also got, there's one of those 6 degrees of Jamie Moyer or whatever things when it goes back to 19th century baseball.
Oh, I'm sure you could get to Cy Young in less than 6 players using Jamie Moyer. For sure. Just going back to Steve Carlton, for God's sakes. Carlton, that'd take you into the 60s.
You know, one thing that I actually found pretty... When I dug into Jamie Moyer a bit, one thing that blew me away, he only was on one All-Star team. Mm-hmm. He has more top 6 Cy Young finishes than he has All-Star appearances.
And he was well into his 40s when he did it.
And he's 35th all-time on wins in MLB at 269. Mm-hmm. Only one All-Star appearance. I'm going to guess there's not many guys in the top 40 of all-time wins that haven't really, unless the All-Star team wasn't around. Probably you're not going to find that very often. I just think it just shows his consistency and just longevity, how remarkable that is.
And I think when it comes to wins and some of the other stats, he's very similar to Jack Morris and Jim Cott, although he's really a compiler of stats because of the amount of years is how he got there, not necessarily, because he was at the top of each of those categories each year. But still a remarkable career, and good on you, Jamie Moyer. And still, I don't think anybody, if he comes out for Old Timers Day, wants to face him. Come on, who wants to face Jamie Moyer, even in an Old Timers game?
So speaking of great players, I want to move on to hockey. We talked a lot about baseball, but I want to talk about hockey. And on May 8th, 1995, Mark Messier of the New York Rangers became the third member of the 100 playoff goal club. The other two members at the time were Gretzky and Jari Kurri, two players you might have heard of. And there's been one other player since 1995 that had joined Mark Messier, and that is Brett Hull. So there's really only 4 players in that 100 playoff goal club. And so he won 6 Stanley Cups, as you know, 5 with Edmonton, and then 1 with the Rangers. And so, there's always this conversation about Messier and Gretzky are kind of tied at the hip. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of Messier's history and sort of when he won it although he won a cup in Edmonton without Gretzky, but then when he got to the Rangers, he also won the cup. So how important was that for his career, do you think?
I think it's immensely important for his career legacy, because I don't know that you would necessarily run into anybody that says Mark Messier is not a top 10 player, if not top 5 player. There's a number of people, including Wayne Gretzky, who will say Mark Messier is better than Mario Lemieux. I'll take him any day. You're talking Gordie Howe territory, and Gretzky and Ovechkin and Messier. They're at the top. He's Willie Mays of the hockey world. But he was on that Edmonton team with those guys that you had mentioned, right? Jari Kurri and Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier and Esa Tikkanen, and that powerhouse Edmonton Oiler roster that really took over the second half of the 1980s. The beginning half was the Islanders, and then the Oilers beat the Islanders, and then it became the Oilers dynasty for the rest of that decade. And when Wayne Gretzky got traded to the LA Kings after the 1988 Stanley Cup that they won, the big question was what's going to happen to hockey in Los Angeles and what's going to happen to hockey in Edmonton. And will the Oilers, can they survive? Is there more to this Edmonton team than just Wayne Gretzky? And the very first year that Gretzky wasn't there, the answer was no. It was not. That they got bounced out of the playoffs. Edmonton was largely in that 88-89 season irrelevant. And the question was, could they come back? And Mark Messier really took over that team, and he started wearing the C, and he was the captain, and it became his team. And for him to win that cup without Wayne Gretzky, I think would be enough for anybody to say, okay, look at what he did. It's like when Tom Brady won the Super Bowl without Bill Belichick, that they said, oh, well, there's a lot to, Tom Brady. Look at what he was able to do without Bill. That's the same thing, I think, for Mark Messier. And then for him to go to New York and to break the curse, and after it had been forever that the New York Rangers had won the Stanley Cup, for him to do it there on top of what he did in Edmonton, it puts him in another stratosphere. And, we saw with Gretzky, he didn't have any more cups once he left Edmonton. He got there one time with the Kings, got beat by the Canadiens, but that was it for Wayne Gretzky. And there's the question. But nobody ever asked the question, did Wayne Gretzky need Mark Messier?
Right.
Did Wayne Gretzky need Jari Kurri? I don't know.
Yeah, I was about to ask that.
Yeah, maybe. But the thing about Messier is that he could do so many things. He wasn't just a scorer. He was a defense first, physical center, and he could play the wing. He could score. He could go out and slobber knock somebody if that's what was needed. He could take a double team and feed the puck. There was not a thing on the ice that Mark Messier couldn't do. And for me, he's a top fiver of all time.
Yeah, he's actually the first, and I think the only player to captain 2 different Stanley Cup teams, the Oilers post Gretzky and then the Rangers, which is pretty remarkable. And I think not to overlook his leadership, right? I think that was something even Gretzky cites his leadership. In fact, the NHL created the Messier Leadership Award because it directly reflects his who he was, and I think that comes through in so much of what he's done, especially under Gretzky or with Gretzky, where he had no problem letting Gretzky sort of be the star player, and he would essentially kind of be that 1B to the 1A with Gretzky, or in some cases let other players sort of step up and have some of that limelight. For as great as he was, he didn't really get named to that many All-Star teams, 5, considering how we're putting him in the top 5. You're not going to see that very often. A few All-Star appearances, but it was just shows the depth of the team that he was on.
It certainly does, and the defining moments that he had in New York during that run, and if you go back to Game 5 of the Eastern Conference Finals against the Devils, Rangers are on home ice. It's 2-2. It's win this game, and you're one away from going to the Stanley Cup Final, and all of the years and years and years of disappointment are gone. Rangers lose in typical Ranger fashion on home ice in Game 5. They have to go to New Jersey to play Game 6. The papers are hounding him. Everyone it's woe is me. The sky has fallen all over the New York Rangers. And he comes out and he says, I guarantee to the paper, I guarantee we win Game 6. And not only do they win Game 6, but he scores a hat trick in Game 6. And everyone always thinks, oh, yeah, and then they went on to the Stanley Cup. But they didn't. They had to go back and play Game 7 after the highest of highs. And they have a double overtime game against the Devils on home ice and end up going to the Stanley Cup. And it was remarkable. It was a great time to be in New York, the 90s, with the success that the Knicks had, although they were unable to get the championship. They were in the playoffs, and they had all that going on with Reggie Miller, and they had the OJ championship, and then to see the Rangers be as relevant as they were, and of course you saw what the Yankees did during that time, and the Giants even got a Super Bowl title in the 90s. So it was a great time to be there, and Mark Messier was one of the toasts of the town, and I don't know that you could really quantify how much that one championship meant to an organization, particularly one that hasn't had very many.
Yeah, so it's fun. I just wanted to note, to me, Mark, when I think of the Rangers, I do think of Mark Messier, even though he was on the Edmonton team, but it always comes to mind first. The Rangers always, even though it's only one Stanley Cup, which I find really unusual because he won most of his championships with Edmonton, but to me, he's just synonymous with the New York Rangers, and that's who I always think of first when I hear Mark Messier.
Yeah, there are certain players that are like that, and Randy Johnson is one of them. He won his World Series in Arizona, but Randy Johnson is a Mariner in my head, and that's the same way with Mark Messier. And Mark Messier didn't even stay in New York much longer than this. He went to Vancouver for 3 seasons and then came back and finished as a New York Ranger. But I think a lot of people forget about that 3-year stint in Vancouver after the Rangers before coming back. But no, he's Mr. New York Ranger, 100%.
Okay, I want to move on to the NBA and talk about another great player. So going from a great 90s player in the NHL to a great 90s player in the NBA. On May 4th, 1994, Charles Barkley had a monster playoff game with 56 points, beating when he was with the Suns. They swept the Warriors 140 to 133, swept them out of the first round of the playoffs, although the Suns would eventually lose to the Rockets, later that playoff, thus depriving Barkley of his ring. And every time you hear Charles Barkley as the player, people think of him now on TNT, but when you think of him as the player, he's always sort of in that sort of small circle of the greatest players to never win a championship. So does all that get kind of lost in his sort of persona that he's sort of rebranded himself as lately?
I think it's always there because it's something that they always joke with him about, and he's so warm and understanding and will not allow it to bother him, and sort of goes along with the prank all the time. But I think what gets lost is just how good he was. But the sad part is maybe he could have been better if he would have taken his health and his body more seriously. It's that old thing of like, people say, well, think about how good Babe Ruth would have been if he was an athlete. That's the kind of the thing about, think about how good Charles Barkley would be if he was an athlete. And if the Sixers hadn't made one of the great blunders of all time and traded Moses Malone away and had kept Moses Malone and Charles Barkley together instead of throwing Moses Malone away on a terrible trade right after Dr. J retired, that if Moses Malone would have had more time to work with him and mentor him of maybe who Charles Barkley could have become. Because there's that great story of Charles Barkley asking Moses Malone, what he needed to work on in his game. And he said, a lot, you're fat and you're lazy. That was his assessment, his scouting report of Charles Barkley. And Charles Barkley was like, whoa, wait a second. Moses Malone just said I'm fat and lazy. Maybe I'm fat and lazy. And Moses Malone put him on a workout routine. He said, all right, I want you to play, you're right, 300 right now. I want you to get down to 290. And he got down to 290 and played a little better. And he goes, I want you to get to 280. And he got to 280 and he played a little better. And he goes, I want you to get to 270. And he started to feel really athletic and started to not get tired at nights. And he's like, I want you to play at 260. And he just kept going down until they sort of found that weight. And he's like, yeah, okay, that's your weight. That's what you play at. But Moses Malone had that gravitas with somebody like Charles Barkley that could motivate him in a way that maybe he couldn't be motivated before.
Yeah, I love watching Inside the NBA. It's probably my favorite sports talk show. As much as I love baseball, I think I enjoy the conversation on Inside the NBA, especially when the regular crew is together. And Charles Barkley feels like he has a lot of sort of wisdom that he shares, and you can tell he's reflecting on mistakes he made earlier in his career, and he'll even admit that sometimes. And also his famous comment that he always brings up, Father Time is undefeated. That's his kind of go-to a lot of times. So you're right, yeah, if he took care of his body and sort of, was a little more mature in his younger years, what would that have looked like in terms of his career? We did have a great comment on our social media post. I want to ask you what you think. Someone said, is Charles Barkley or Elgin Baylor considered the greatest player to never win a ring? I have maybe a different player than those two, but I will first want to hear who you think is the greatest player to never win a ring.
The thing that's crazy is that it's so hard to believe that Elgin Baylor never won one.
Right.
That's nuts to me. That he was out there all that time. He's got a statue outside for the Lakers, and he doesn't have a championship. That's nuts to me. But I think about Charles Barkley, and the guy that really sort of to me comes to mind as sort of an individual player, and you realize he never played on maybe as good a team. I think about Karl Malone quite a bit. When it comes to that, but not having seen Elgin Baylor on a regular basis, just in highlights, when you talk NBA, it's Karl Malone, Charles Barkley are always shocking to me that neither one of them was able to get it done. But I think maybe Karl Malone a little bit more because he did have Stockton to help him, and then Charles Barkley always seemed to be all by himself wherever he was.
Yeah, same with Allen Iverson, right? A little bit sort of on his own. He had a lot of supporting players around him, but sort of that same sort of Barkley sort of structure there where it was really all kind of on his shoulders.
I think that's a Philadelphia 76ers rule. You're only allowed to have one good player at a time.
Maybe. I'm with you. Karl Malone, 2 MVPs.
Mm-hmm.
He, compared to the others who just got one. So maybe... I love John Stockton. I loved watching John Stockton growing up just because I love the finesse of passing and defense and all of that. But it was really just the two of them on that Jazz team, and they didn't really have much beyond those two players. We also talked about the NBA in 1993 when the Hornets kind of put an end to the Celtics era with Kevin McHale. And it was on May 6th that they ended up beating Boston in the first round of the Eastern Conference Finals. And then right after the game, McHale retired. On that Hornets team was Larry Johnson, Grandmama. Everyone loved Grandmama.
UNLV.
That's right. But also probably the better player, Alonzo Mourning, though it was his rookie year. He did end up second in Rookie of the Year voting. But he went on to have a really fantastic career. And sort of that sort of playoff signaled sort of a changing of the guard. Not that Charlotte became this huge powerhouse, but it was really the end of that great Celtics era, and they had about a decade before they were relevant again. Any thoughts on that? Kind of losing McHale there is just so underrated and so fantastic.
It was for me. It was really not just a changing of era of teams that were going to be relevant, particularly in the East, because you had that second run of Michael Jordan and the Bulls, and you had the Heat emerging with Alonzo Mourning after the trade. But it was really about the style of player. It was almost like the end of the Kevin McHale player and the beginning of the Alonzo Mourning player that really dominated the rest of the 90s and the early 2000s, because a guy like McHale was an offensive-centric power forward, and Alonzo Mourning was more of a rim protector in a way that we saw the handful of bruisers in the 90s that were going to clog the lane and make it a real physical task, where McHale was the kind of guy that would go around you, and McHale was the kind of guy that would guard you with his feet. And we think about Kevin McHale sometimes as not maybe being as great a defender because he's kind of goofy looking and he looks like Herman Munster, and like, how can that guy move? But Kevin McHale was 6-time all defense. He was really, really good. But he wasn't the rim protector in the physical presence of somebody like Alonzo Mourning. And this game just sort of really signaled the beginning of the end. And if you go back and you watch that play that you're talking about, Larry Johnson brings the ball into the lane and gets a pretty decent look. And it's Alonzo Mourning fighting for the rebound and able to knock it off the Celtics that gives them the second chance. And then Alonzo Mourning's able to hit the shot that sends them moving forward. But yeah, for me, it's a real big opportunity to think about how the game sort of changed, and Alonzo Mourning now became the center of what we want our power forward position to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about relevant NBA now, and someone like Kevin McHale would be so good in today's NBA because he had the ability to maneuver on the court, and he knew how to sort of fit into the style of play that was going on, and he could play defense, but he didn't have to be the defender. He could shoot, but he didn't have to be the top scorer. Robert Parrish, who was strong defensive presence. Larry Bird was a great defensive player, and so I think McHale really fit into sort of morphed into what they needed because he was so versatile in his style of play and his ability to do so many different things on the court, whatever was needed at the time.
And he was odd because he was a big man with a mid-range because he sort of grew up in the dawn of the three-point era where your big guys still shot 12-footers, which is something that you don't really see all that much now. If he were playing today, he would have to really develop a three-point shot. But if I think about it, maybe a comparable comp, and I think McHale might be a little bigger than him, but I think about if Lauri Markkanen of the Jazz ever decided he wanted to play defense, that he could be a Kevin McHale type because he can get an 8 or a 10-foot shot off at will if you wanted to play his back to the basket and use his maneuverability. The way that the Jazz run their offense, that's never going to happen. It's either going to be cutting to the basket or shooting a three. But if you took a guy like Lauri Markkanen and you planted him into the Celtics, and could he fill that Kevin McHale role, I think if you coached him up a little and gave him the incentive to play defense, that would be a comparable modern NBA player.
Yeah, and I think McHale understood spacing, right? And his footwork was incredible. So I just think that he was such a fun player to watch, just because you kind of knew what you were getting with Bird. You kind of knew what you were getting with Parrish. You kind of knew, you know, but with him, you kind of adapted to the game as the flow of the game went. You kind of saw what was needed. And so I don't know. I just enjoyed that Celtics team. I'm not a Celtics fan, but they're just such a fun team to watch.
Yeah, and two really tough guys, Mourning and McHale, in very different ways. I think Alonzo Mourning was the tough guy that says, I'm going to punch you in the face. And Kevin McHale was the tough guy that says, after you punch me in the face, I'm still standing here. Those were the kind of guys that they were, where, you know, your Alonzo Mourning was a real alpha tough guy. And Kevin McHale was just, a dock worker tough guy. But both of them really, really hard-nosed players, both stellar citizens off the court. And you always wonder what would Alonzo Mourning have been if he hadn't had the kidney trouble and have to have that surgery. And even when he came back and he knew that he was never going to be the player that he was before the kidney problems, that he was willing to take on that role with the Heat. He did win his championship. He was able to coexist in a Shaquille O'Neal Heat world. And kudos to Alonzo Mourning. I was so happy that he made it into the Hall of Fame.
All right, Clayton, we're going to go call it there. We're going to wrap it up. I want to thank you as always for joining me. For everyone out there, if you like history as much as we do, please follow us. Share, comment on our posts, and if you make any comments and they're may bring them up during the show, talk about those. But follow us on Sports and Leisure on Facebook, Substack, YouTube. Subscribe, share, and as always, please share the knowledge, because as much as we love talking sports, we love sharing it even more.
Yeah.
All right,
so
Clayton, have a great week.
You too, and enjoy. Anybody that wants to, 2:30 this morning, Iva Jovic, Coco Gauff, live from Rome. That's where I'm headed.
I'm going to set my alarm.
You do that. See you next week, guys.
All right, see you.